One portion of our program tonight is called Remembering Canadian Lutheran World Relief for the Sake of the Gospel. In this section, I'm going to offer you a propositional history. Well, what is a propositional history? It's a history where I'm opening up my read of the stories and the resources at my disposal to suggest a history, and then inviting you, the reader, the listener, the fellow Lutheran, Canadian Lutheran, to join me in discovering the extent to which that proposed history is full or accurate or complete. I'm inviting you to join me in remembering Canadian Lutheran World Relief as you have experienced it, as you know it from the stories that you have read, and as part of the call for papers for our upcoming webinar and in-person conference. Propositional history is best done in community. It says rather humbly that nobody has the whole truth, the whole story. And so together we might be able to come forward with a more fulsome, more accurate, more helpful story by working together. And so tonight I invite you into the story of Canadian Lutheran World Relief, not CLWR specifically. That institutional history I leave to the staff of CLWR, who have been doing an exceptional job of creating videos, particularly for the 75th anniversary of CLWR that just passed last year. And to those, I would turn you with all enthusiasm to watch. They are excellent rememberings. But Canadian Lutheran World Relief is somewhat bigger than CLWR, and in many ways it undergirded the institution of CLWR. Canadian Lutheran World Relief is part of our being as Canadian Lutherans. It is part of our response to the gospel call. It is who we have been and who we are. And CLWR is one outward expression of that inner reality of our experience the gospel and living that out in the context of our lives from coast to coast to coast in Canada since Lutherans arrived in Canada, and not just since CLWR began in 1946. So tonight I'm going to tell you two propositional histories that relate to our roots, our Canadian Lutheran World Relief roots. The first I call relationships, coastal compassion. The second I call mid-century concord and discord. These stories will take us all across Canada in different time periods, across geographies and generations. I'm offering these to you because it's my hope that opening up these stories and many diverse resources will enable you to think about how you might enter into the story and what resources you have at your disposal that you might bring to bear as we together remember today for the church of tomorrow and respond to the gospel for the sake of the gospel. Having read an enormous amount of Canadian Lutheran history sources, I'd like to offer a word on our usual source books and make a reference to the histories that are not in our current history books. Pastor Valdemar Island's book, Lutherans in Canada, was published in 1945. He had been a member of the Norwegian, Icelandic, and Pacific synods, and he was compiling contributions from others such as John Rebley and Rex Schneider, and using commemorative publications to do original research. His congregation in Winnipeg of the Icelandic Synod was a member of the ULCA. And in the August 1945 introduction, Franklin Clark Fry noted that the formation of a Canadian Lutheran Council was imagined to be in hand. So Island's book was written with a union in mind. And the book is organized by major synodical groupings and is ethnicity forward so that the different Lutheran groups in Canada could get to know each other and form the Canadian Lutheran Council. It is a great book for understanding, for example, Danish and Finnish Lutherans in Canada. Pastor Norman Trinan and Karl Kronmiller published after Islands. These authors build on his work, and each of these add considerable careful original research to the picture of Canadian Lutheran history. Trinan leans more so towards the understanding of the Missouri Synod and LCC, and Western Prairie German Lutheran perspectives, while Kronmiller leads towards the understanding of the ULCA and Lutheran Church in America, particularly English-speaking and Eastern perspectives. Pastor George Evenson, in contrast, leans heavily on Western Canadian experiences to tell the stories of the people who became together the Canada District of the American Lutheran Church in 1961, which officially in 1967 was recognized as the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada, the ELCC. Evenson writes towards the possibility of merger for all Lutherans in Canada in the 1970s. He was a member of the Joint Commission on Inter-Lutheran Relationships in 1970, at the launch of the Affirmation and Appeal, and a speaker at the 1954 Today, Tomorrow conference. So all of these writers have done great Canadian Lutheran history, but they've done it in a Sitz im Leben, a setting in life, and their books were published towards a purpose. It has been too long since we've had a new history book that relates to our current realities. For example, beginning in 2007, my husband served Maranatha Caribbean Lutheran Congregation here in Waterloo, and their 30-year congregational history, for example, is not reflected at all in the books by Islands or Kronmiller or Trinan or Evenson, in part because their history comes after these other writers, but also in part because they would be a minority community within the larger church. In these two consensus online articles by myself in 2012 that features Lutherans and Indigenous communities, and in 2022 that considers Lutherans and sexuality, you will find a significant number of hyperlinks to Canadian Lutheran history so that wherever you are in Canada or around the world, you can conduct your own research so that we can make a history book that truly reflects Canadian Lutheran history today for the sake of the church tomorrow. Tonight I'd like to begin where George Evenson began in his book, Adventuring for Christ, which is a history of the ELCC, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada, a predecessor to our current ELCIC, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. In the first story, I will couple the work of George Evenson with the work of Norm Antler. I'll begin with Evenson's launch in the BC Synod to get us thinking about our roots and the stories that we choose to remember and choose not to remember, and then turn to the Norm Antler collection to fill out the story. Norman Antler was a member of the Canadian Lutheran Historical Association, and he wrote to every congregation in Canada, every ELCIC congregation, and asked them to send him their congregational histories. As a result, we have an incredible resource of Canadian Lutheran congregational histories written almost exclusively by lay leaders from coast to coast to coast, organized by ELCIC Synod. When I picked up his collection from his home in Pembroke, Ontario, his works reminded me of those little brag books that grandmothers used to keep in their purses. And when they were gathered with a group of friends, they would reach into their purse and pull out their brag book and show off all of the photographs of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and tell the stories of the development of their lives and how proud they were of all of those who have carried on their legacy. In the second story, I'm going to bring forward the writings of E. Theodore Bachman and Mark Granquist, two American Lutheran historians who will help us understand the time period of the General Synod that Gordon referred to during our last webinar. And I'm going to couple that with the work of Karl Kronmiller, who gives us what was happening in Canada at the same time, and just a very little bit from Frank Malinsky, whom Gordon referenced, who tells the Lutheran Church Canada or Missouri Synod perspective. I'll tell you about Canadian Lutheranism in 1853. Canadian Lutheranism existed between the two polar opposites of Schmucker and Walter. In 1853, there would have been no Lutheran congregations or clergy who completely agreed with either Schmucker or Walter. To my read of the historical account, Schmucker and his writing partners, because he didn't write the definite platform alone, were doing contextual theology. They were, in some senses, having a seminary-led thought experiment in theology, and it was for the consideration of the synod. It was not a document giving direction to the General Synod. Schmucker had been with William Passavant to a global ecumenical conference in Europe, where he encountered Swedish Lutheranism and Norwegian Lutheranism, manifestations of the gospel as it was received and passed down in these ethnic and geographical contexts. But there was no American Lutheranism, and Schmucker was exploring that, just as we are exploring Canadian Lutheranism now. At about this time, we know from Frank Malinsky that Johann Adam Ernst was reading writings by C.F.W. Walter and wondering about an alliance of Ernst's Ohio colleagues with Walter and his Missouri fellows. Quoting Granquist, meeting in Chicago in 1847, the Saxon Missouri pastors, along with the Bavarian pastors from Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, met and formed the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, subsequently often referred to as the Missouri Synod. The collision between these two poles and personalities in Lutheranism in the United States in the mid-1800s should remind us of the collision of the two poles in the 1700s between Muhlenberg and Zinzendorf, and we in the 1900s have had our big personality clashes and the collision of Lutheranisms as well. We are perhaps now in a time period in North American Lutheran history like that one in the mid-1850s. There are now, as there were then, lots of splintered groups saying, "Here I stand," but doing so in separate enclaves or conclaves, separate spaces, trying to discern discipleship paths, to understand what it is that they were called to for the sake of the gospel. In 1853 in Canada, there would have been no congregations or clergy who agreed with C.F.W. Walter because there were at the time no Missouri Synod Lutheran churches or clergy in Canada. And similarly, there would be no clergy or congregations who believed in the definitive platform of Samuel Simon Schmucker, Benjamin Kurtz, and Samuel Sprecher, because the Canadian Lutheran experience was so different than the American experience. Unhelpfully, their fighting for two different versions of Lutheranism in America had impacts in Canada. For women and persons of diverse racial and ethnic identity, it splintered congregations and families and impeded the ability of Canadian Lutherans to meet the needs of the hurting and hungry in their communities and around the world. And I hope thereafter that you will be inspired to join me and Steve and Gordon and Dawn and many others in remembering today for the Church of tomorrow, that you will join us in looking again at our histories so that we can reflect on our legacy and our call for the sake of the gospel, and that you might write and send in your own submissions or presentation papers for the conference that we hope to hold in 2023.